All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's show on Polystrate fossils. Poly meaning many, and strata meaning rock layers. And I am thrilled to have both Paul Price and Ian Juby, two brothers who have studied this topic extensively, to show us exactly why polystrate fossils provide amazing evidence for young Earth creation and the Genesis flood. Gentlemen, it is great to have you both here for this much anticipated program. If you don't mind, let's get a couple brief introductions just to get people familiar with the two of you. Ian, it is your first time here on the Standing for Truth platform. Your work has been a huge blessing to us here at the ministry. And so, Ian, how are you today? And if you could, a little bit about yourself.
Well, good evening, Donnie. Thanks for having me. I can't believe you guys let me on. But I tell you, too, I've had so many people over the years have asked, when are you going to be on Standing for Truth? You guys are like infamous or stuff, you know. So anyway, really good to be here. Yeah, I've been doing the creation science thing for, well, probably started 1991, so I don't know. It's late at night. I don't want to be doing math, but it's a long time anyway. Been doing and there's Doki Doki Bible Club. He hangs out on our stream all the time too. I actually see a lot of familiar names. It's good to see everyone. It's fun to see everyone over here as well. So I was in full-time creation ministry for about 8 years, traveling on the road, and then I switched it up, wound up starting to produce Genesis Week, the TV show, which is now aired internationally for 11 years. So that's been pretty much what I've been doing now for 11 years now. I still do a little bit of touring, but very little. And usually when I'm on the tours, I get to do research. For example, that's where I did a lot of my research in Joggins. Although the first few times I went, it was just I'd heard so much about it in creation and evolution circles that I had to go investigate it for myself. And it was in Canada, so I'm like, this is perfect, you know. Even though, like we were talking before we went live, we were talking about, you know, the distance and everything, and how all may be closer than you. A lot of people don't get that. It's like, welcome to Ontario, where you can drive for, you know, it takes me 23 hours to drive to Manitoba from here. You know, it's like 23 hours, I'm still in Ontario. But anyway, enough about that.
No, that's great. As Doki Doki says here, us Canadians have to stick together. So we do have a fair share of Canadians in our chat. And Doki, my faithful mod, looks like you've got a Noah's Flood movie coming out soon, Ian Juby. So there's a trailer if people want to see it. And also all of the relevant links to your channels on Rumble and your website, YouTube, so on and so forth. So you're already a fan favorite, Ian. With both the critics and non-critics, put it that way. Yep. So it's great to have you. Appreciate the introduction. Paul, as always, it's a pleasure to have you. You're certainly no stranger to Standing for Truth. You've been here for formal debates, informal debates, and what seems to be people's favorite kind of program, these presentations followed by open mic showdowns. So Paul, how have you been, brother? And also a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been busy, but I like keeping busy. And, for a lot of the people that may not know me previously, I started my journey into creation apologetics in high school when I would say it was probably the year 2000 when I was entering high school as a ninth grader, and I got challenged by atheism for the first time. And suddenly, this cognitive dissonance that I grew up with, the Bible is true because this is what I'm taught to believe at church and my family. And then on the other hand, all of my favorite movies and TV shows and everything, all of the textbooks, were all telling a different story. And I guess that all crystallized at that time, and I realized how important it was for me to get to the bottom of this and seek answers. And that's how I got into creation apologetics. I've been doing it either, as an amateur or for a brief period of about 6 years as a professional when I was formerly with Creation Ministries International. And so I was blessed to be able to write a whole lot of articles. That's how I first got connected up with Ian Juby here, who I'm such a big fan of. But I believe I was reading some of his work in the book Rock Solid Answers, and I wanted some more information. I remember I wrote into Ian asking a question about polystrate fossils. He wound up turning that question into a very comprehensive article on his website, which was very helpful, which I then turned around and wrote an article to put onto creation.com about the Joggins polystrate fossils. And the reason I do stuff like that is that I'm all about trying to push the envelope where it hurts the enemy the most. I want to attack where the evidence is really decisive. I don't want to have debates about things that, can go either way, or they really don't make much difference in your worldview. They're not very evidentially powerful. I want to hit where, you strike while the iron is hot, so to speak. So I believe polystrate fossils have always been one of those red hot topics in creation and evolution. And so when you approached me about, well, what do you think we should talk about next? This is the topic that came to my mind. And obviously Ian Juby is one of the, I guess you could say, one of the world's experts on polystrate fossils. And so it was just providence. I had no idea Ian was working together with with a whole team of people to actually put forth a movie about Noah's flood. I had no idea that was even going on. So it's very providential timing that we're talking about it right now. But I did get a chance to watch the preview that came out a while back of the movie, and it was really, really well produced, and I loved it. So I recommend it to people for sure.
Awesome, Paul. I appreciate that introduction. It is a red hot topic. And again, I'm just so happy to have the both of you who have studied this topic extensively. We've been focusing on lines of evidence, as you put it, Paul, that are discriminatory or differentiating in terms of the origins debate. Dinosaur soft tissue or collagen, specifically in our last open mic, and now tonight, polystrate fossils, amazing evidence for the Genesis flood. So to those in the chat wondering, yes, after the presentation, we will be opening it up for Q&A and also some impromptu discussion. And so for those who want to join, yep.
Sorry, before I forget to address this real quick, I did see in the live chat someone asked a clarifying question about something I just said, where I said somebody is the enemy. And Robin Webster asked, why are people who disagree with you the enemy? I actually wasn't referring to people. I was referring to principalities. The Bible says we are at war cosmically, and the true enemy is not people who are ensnared in some type of deception or another. It is the powers and principalities and demonic forces that we are truly, at war with here. So those are the enemy. I'm not referring, to individuals and people as my enemy here, just to clarify that. But thanks, Donnie.
Hey, my pleasure, gentlemen. This is going to be great. Evie Miller says the preview of the Noah's movie was fascinating. So that's great, Ian. Excellent work. For those that want to see more from Ian and Paul, do check the description box of this video, where I do have the relevant links posted, including the article that you wrote on creation.com there, Paul. And of course, in the live chat, we've got all the relevant links there for people. So with that, let's get right into the presentation. I am pumped for this. I'm excited to see what you are going to present here, Paul. And so whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, so the Joggins Cliffs. Now, for the audience, what I want to try to do here is to really provide a scaffolding for this important topic and kind of get us a baseline. And then from there, our guest Ian is going to have the platform to shine as the real expert here. but I wanted to put together a good scaffold, if you will, to just get us started off on this topic. So that's what this presentation is. The Joggins Cliffs, Polystrate fossils, and other fascinating features. So going back to the very beginning of the origins controversy in the Western world, the Joggins Cliffs have played a central role in the debate. Lyell himself and many after him have attempted to interpret this evidence according to a belief in millions of years of past history and without reference to the flood. Ironically, though, Joggins represents one of the most striking places on Earth, demonstrating clear evidence of Noah's global flood. So I've curated a few helpful little clips here that I want to show as part of this presentation. So this will be the first one. And yeah, this is obviously coming from a secular point of view, but let's get an intro here onto these cliffs.
It's amazing to realize that the classic section of the Joggins fossil cliffs, which is about 1 kilometer in length, represents about 1 million years of geological time.
Just above me here is the Fundy Forest. In my opinion, this is the best location along the whole Joggins section. More important fossils have come from this location than anywhere else in the whole section. We're finding fossilized trees with amphibians and reptiles inside, and the next big fossil is probably going to come from this location.
Your first time at Joggins, when you're looking for these trees, make sure you look for the large column-like structures in the cliffs. Once you get your eyes accustomed to them, you can't miss them.
All right, so that's fascinating. Now, this next slide here has a little clip of a video introducing Grand Canyon, which is another one of these really striking places where we can see lots of exposed strata and we can see so much evidence for the flood. But I want you to notice a couple of things. Notice how they appeal to a succession of gradualistic events over a long period of time in order to explain how we get the layers. But I also want you to notice just how vastly different the timescales are between these two features here.
Pretty awesome, isn't it? The Grand Canyon is one of the most spectacular natural wonders on Earth. 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its widest, and more than a mile deep into Earth's crust. No one was around to see it form, but its story is written in all of those beautiful rock layers. Geologists are kind of like time-traveling detectives. They look for fingerprints here and there, retrace the footsteps to retell Earth's story as best as we can. Now, the Native American people in this area call this canyon Kaibab, which means mountain lying down or upside down mountain. And they didn't know how right they were, because down there at the bottom of the canyon, the oldest rocks are mountains.
The oldest rocks at the bottom of the canyon are named after the Hindu god Vishnu. About 1.8 billion years ago, the area that's now the Grand Canyon was covered in mountains taller than the Himalayas. But over hundreds of millions of years, erosion wore them down into hills just tens of meters tall.
From this point on, the evolution of the Grand Canyon doesn't happen in a dry desert like you see today. It happens underwater. Ancient oceans filled this area from 1 billion years ago to as recently as 80 million years ago. That water would rise and fall and rise and fall again, depositing sand and mud and even ancient seashells, compressing them into rock, piling layer upon layer and creating this colorful layer cake just waiting to be cut.
All right, I like that. But now, okay, notice how wildly inconsistent the secular geologists are forced to be when it comes to timescales. An entire kilometer section at Joggins is said to represent only 1 million years, while the Grand Canyon, which is about 1.8 kilometers deep, so that's not even twice as large, is said to represent up to 1.8 billion years, albeit with unconformities or large gaps of missing hundreds of millions of years. Sure. But when it comes to polystrate fossils, which are fossils cutting through multiple strata, multiple layers, The big debate is mostly about whether or not they are in situ, meaning buried where they grew. The old earthers are forced to claim that these items, these polystrate fossils, are buried in situ because to admit that they were ripped up and deposited would look too much like a global flood for their comfort. Thus, they are forced to walk a fine line between uniformitarianism, which is slow, gradual processes, the present is the key to the past, and catastrophism, which is the view of catastrophes. So they have to walk a fine line between these two. They have to say it was slow and gradual, but then at the same time, they have to admit that floods and local catastrophes happened in order to account for what we see. So let's look here at an example of this polystrate lycopsid or lycopod, which is an ancient fossil reed, a giant reed. We don't have them like this today. They don't grow this large. But notice here, this is supposed to be in situ. Notice the lack of any clearly defined soil horizon. Where is the forest floor supposed to be in this cross section? You can see the roots. Okay, where I see the roots, where is the soil supposed to start? Where is that ancient forest floor supposed to be? There's no clear objective answer to that question. I see lots of little stripes and strata going way up higher than you would imagine the forest floor to be. So there isn't any clear demarcation line. Now, according to this particular peer-reviewed study, the role of evaporite withdrawal in the preservation of a unique coal-bearing succession. So it's talking about Joggins. It says, and I've highlighted the relevant portion here, Joggins lycopsids are generally entombed by stacked packages of heterolithic strata that make burial by a single catastrophic flood or earthquake unlikely, according to undocumented personal communication from J.H. Calder. Okay, I want you to remember that. Stacked packages of heterolithic strata. Now, it goes on to say, if complete burial is assumed to have occurred within 100 years, and then it goes on to talk about the rate of sedimentation. So according to them, according to the secular viewpoint, this entire polystrate lycopsid is supposed to have been buried top to bottom in no more than a century. So talk about deep time. That's not deep time at all. A century is very rapid, but they're not willing to say that it happened all at once. Now, the information that I learned here in this particular presentation and others like it that reference this material was a really big eye-opener to me, and I think it's going to be an eye-opener to a lot of you because this just isn't something that gets talked about. So let's listen here to Drama in the Rocks, just a curated clip that I've got here of this documentary here.
One of the problems facing geologists today is the fossilized tree. There are a number of examples in Australia and America and elsewhere where a fossilized tree can be seen running vertically through a number of coal seams. Here's an example from the coalfields of Birmingham in Alabama in the United States. Some of these fossilized trees, 12 meters or more in height, can be seen running through a number of banks. This model gives some idea of the situation. Now, the curious thing is that we are told that any one of these banks takes millions of years to form. Now, if this was the case, it would take millions of years to bury the tree. But that's not possible because the tree would decompose or rot long before it was all buried. So, what is the explanation? It's important to know the difference between a layer and a bank. These are banks, these areas colored orange and yellow and bluish. In each bank, you can see a number of strata. What you can't see are the layers. You can't see them because as each layer of sediment arrived, it sorted itself out into the banks that you can see. If you could see them, they would look something like this. One of the first sedimentary rock experts was a German. His name was Johannes Walter. Whilst in Italy at the end of the last century, he examined the sediments in the Bay of Naples. He discovered, by boring vertically downwards through the sediments in the bay, that the banks that lay on top of each other were in the same sequence as those that were lying next to each other horizontally. The sequence of banks that could be seen lying side by side as he went from the coast out to the sea was the same as the sequence of banks that lay on top of each other in a downwards direction. He realized that the belief that the bank at the bottom was older than the one on top was wrong. Quite obviously, all the banks, the one at the top, the one underneath, and the one at the bottom, were all still forming. They were forming sideways, so that part of the top bank was the same age as part of the bottom bank.
Particle A deposited at a time T1 before particle B. Particle B in the lower strata, therefore, deposited after particle A in the upper strata.
Increasing the flow depth while keeping the discharge and the supply of sediment unchanged results in more complex sedimentary features. Substantial deposits accumulate with features including deltas, dunes, and ripples at various stages of development. A dried delta, viewed from the plume sidewalls, displays clear stratification characteristics in terms of superposition of deposits with similar particle size distribution. A cross-section is cut through the delta to examine the primary features of deposits of sediment mixtures carried out under steady flow and a continuous sediment supply. The cross-section displays a clear superposition of strata of fine particles in white and coarse particles in black with clear lamination. Looking at the cross-section of superposed strata, it is tempting to conclude that the strata correspond to successive sedimentary layers, that they result from discontinuous sedimentary periods, that each strata is younger than the one underneath it and older than the one above it, and that all points of the same strata have the same age.
The stratification experiment invalidates these hypotheses because these strata are not identical to successive layers. Moreover, clear stratification is observed on the continuous supply of heterogeneous sand particles.
I like this guy's style, by the way. So it's just shocking to me. It's so amazing when you see that strata that look very similar to what we see at places like Grand Canyon and Joggins can be formed rapidly, and in fact they do form rapidly based on the laws of physics, based on the characteristics of the various parts of the sediment slurry. They sort themselves out, and that's why you see these nice, neat, well-defined straight lines, which is very much not what we would expect to see if there had been long periods of erosion between these layers. So based on what we just learned, I've kind of made my own little rudimentary CGI reconstruction of how I think Joggins may have formed. We can let Ian, weigh in on my skills here, but basically I made it in Paint 3D. So what we've got here is Noah's flood happening, and just like we saw in this video, the stratification happens rapidly as water is moving. But now at the conclusion of the flood, when the continents are uplifted rapidly and drastically, you can see that the whole set gets tilted drastically, which is what we see at Joggins. And then as the water is coming off the continents, it planes off the top just flatter than you can imagine. So we get a planation surface. And then, over time, you get a little bit of vegetation growing over the top, and basically you get Joggins today. So that's my reconstruction. So go back here now. Now, based on what we've just seen, let's look again at this lycopsid here. And let's look at these quote unquote stacked packages of heterolithic strata. Are they not exactly what we should expect to find if, in fact, this was buried rapidly, just like we saw in the Flume experiment? What was Calder talking about when he said that these stacked heterolithic strata would somehow not lend themselves to that explanation? On the contrary, they seem very hard to explain. If these were a series of smaller floods in the same area over a period of only 100 years, why are you going to get totally different composition? Why are they so heterolithic? That doesn't make sense. The only thing that makes sense of it is a rapid global catastrophe. Now, also, can you imagine what this is a hollow reed with a soft, pithy center. It's very large, but it has a soft, pithy center. Can you imagine it remaining upright, waiting to eventually get fully buried by a whole succession of local floods for up to a century? That definitely sounds fishy to me. Now, here's where I'm going to address one of the more well-known critics of young Earth creationism, Dr. Duff. I believe he's with us here tonight, so I'm very happy to have Dr. Duff to be able to have this conversation. But one of the things that he wrote on his site is that a cataclysmic flood that caused all these layers of rock to form in days has no power to explain the presence of only amphibians and reptiles to the exclusion of all mammals, dinosaurs, presence of ripple marks, and tracks. So I'm not going to read everything here, but you can go to his website there if you want to read the full article. But boiling down Dr. Duff's list of objections, he names some things that he says we should not find if this were from a global flood. And then he also implies a list of things that we should find, but that we don't. So according to Dr. Duff, and again, if I'm understanding him correctly, we should find 1, flowers and pollen, and we don't. 2, mammals, and 3, birds. I'm assuming he thinks we should find these things simply because we would argue that they were all alive on the earth at the time of the flood. So this type of argument is called an argument from silence. And it can be a good argument sometimes, but it's only ever as strong as the reasons you have for asserting that those things should be found in the first place. Does that make sense? So the strength of an argument from silence comes from how good of an argument you have that the silence shouldn't be there. So what strong reasons can Dr. Duff provide to support his claim that these things should have been found when they weren't? Does he know what the ecology of the pre-flood planet looked like and where everything lived in relation to everything else? Why assume that these things should have been buried together in the same place? And furthermore, we can ask another question. What percentage of all the fossils yet to be discovered at Joggins have ever been cataloged? What percent have been lost forever without being cataloged? We don't know. Any of these things that Dr. Duff wants to find could be found tomorrow, and then he'd have to change his story. Some of them might have been there originally and fallen into the sea, never to be discovered by anyone. Some of them might have been found and yet not reported. After all, the coelacanth disappeared from the fossil record 70 million years ago, allegedly, and yet it is alive and well today. So how can that be? So here's an evolutionist website that is sort of commenting on that. How could coelacanths disappear for over 80 million years and then turn up alive and well in the 20th century? Well, they weren't found in the fossil record for 80 million years. The answer seems to be that the coelacanths from the fossil record lived in environments favoring fossilization. I see. So, in other words, it's okay for the evolutionists to say, well, it's not here because it wasn't in that environment. But then when a creationist uses that same explanation for why we don't find X, Y, or Z in a place, then it's not acceptable for us. I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander, so to speak. According to Dr. Duff, we should not find 1, animal trackways, and 2, ripple marks. And it's unclear from his article why he believes that ripple marks and trackways would be produced by local floods, but not by a global flood. I'm not sure how that logic works. To preserve fine details like ripples and animal footprints, a rapid catastrophic burial would be needed. Obviously, if these delicate features remained exposed for longer periods of time, they would have weathered away to nothing. I previously wrote about another case of animal trackways on the Bright Angel Trail in the Grand Canyon, and they also show evidence of a massive flood and of having been deposited underwater. So if you're interested in trackways, I would recommend checking out, for example, this article that I wrote on the Bright Angel Trail trackways. Now, well, some people will say, well, if it was one big global flood, when was there time for these animals to be producing these trackways and these ripple marks? And we even find fossilized dinosaur eggs and things like that, some of which are in little nests, and they're even in the process of hatching in some cases. Well, Mike Ord, who's been on this channel many times, he developed what he calls the BEDS model, BEDS standing for briefly exposed the diluvial sediments. And this gives us, I think, a very plausible explanation for how things like dinosaur eggs, ripples, trackways, etc. may have been preserved during the flood. So check out Mike Ord's article on the BEDS model. And I will also, again, direct you right to Ian Juby's website, where he wrote this article, ianjuby.org/about polystrate fossils. That is a great resource. One of the things that he mentions, obviously, he took these photos, and he's actually documenting where we're seeing something called negative geotropism, where roots can actually be apparently seen growing upwards above what is supposedly the soil horizon. Now, I know a lot of skeptics are going to want to say, well, Ian, you just drew those lines on there. Those are make-believe. So I'll let Ian handle that type of a remark. But it seems pretty clear to me that we're seeing features here that do not comport with an in situ situation. Here's an example of a root coming from a lycopsid, and you can definitely see that the mud around that root seems to be of a different composition and color than the surrounding sediment, almost as if that root still had some of the original mud from where it grew clinging to it, and it was uprooted. And then another thing that Ian documented was logs like this one here laying prostrate and actually compressed vertically from extreme pressure of overlying sediment. But obviously you can't compress hard rock. This would have been compressed while it was still a log. And with that, I'm going to stop here, and I want to invite Ian to share any thoughts that he has so far. And Donnie, you can kind of moderate and decide if you're ready. And if we have a big lineup, I'm not sure of people wanting to join in the open mic at this point. But Donnie, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, I appreciate that. And the visuals, Paul, as always, very comprehensive. Why don't we hand it to Ian Juby? I'll post the StreamYard link in the live chat, and we'll see if any of the critics or skeptics want to join to challenge anything that's been said so far. So, Ian, I'll hand it over to you for some thoughts on the topic, brother.
Okay. I don't really have a whole pile to add. The one thing Paul mentioned with like wave ripples, for example, when you go to Joggins, especially at the Joggins Fossil Center, they will discuss this in the center. They will claim that there are riverbed channels that are visible in the strata, and they're basically they're bowls is what it is, but they're actually scours. They're not riverbeds, and some of those riverbeds. So when you look at a cross section, the strata dips down into a bowl shape. Well, some of those down below Lower Cove, stratigraphically just below Lower Cove, you can actually see wave ripples in those layers in the alleged riverbed, and the water ripples are actually going across the river channel. So anybody who goes to Joggins can go and see that for yourself. It's just immediately, that would be due east of Lower Cove. If you just hop down to the beach in Lower Cove, there's a very prominent one just out there, not too far away, and all those layers are exposed. Another thing that here, I'll show you on the screen. This was something that we found. I went in, I think this was 2003. We were with the Creation Science Association of Quebec, and a big group of people. We all went there, and from the very first year, these were claimed to be raindrop impressions. And the argument, of course, was that these could not be preserved in a global flood. I disagree on that, but let's take this and run with it for a second. For years, I and many others have found rocks just like this, and this would have been what they thought was like the negative impression. So you've got a layer of mud laid down, raindrops come down, leave these dimple marks, and water drops in the mud, and then another layer of mud fell on top of that, filled in the pits, and hardened. And so that layer on top is what they claimed were these bumps. Well, eventually, many years later, I actually found the layer where all these were coming from, and that is actually upright. So we're not looking at raindrop patterns, we're looking at bumps. So what was it, raining mud drops? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. All I'm saying is, first of all, raindrop impressions, wave ripples, etc., really are not a problem within a global flood context. And as it turns out, even what is claimed to be raindrops turns out wasn't raindrop patterns at all. It was actually bumps. It was actually mud.
That's a good illustration of how what we're doing here is we're trying to act like detectives. We're trying to be like piecing together a crime scene. And obviously there's a lot of subjectivity there. And there's a lot of, well, we just so happen to find what we just so happen to find. And so that's why I always point people to a reliable historical record. We have to have that baseline. Otherwise, we're just making up stories. And that's kind of what I tried to bring out when I gave that presentation on historical versus operational science. But Ian, how would you respond to the critic who says, well, Ian Juby just drew those, he just opened up Microsoft Paint and drew make-believe lines on the picture that don't really represent reality. And I can't see any upside down stumps, and all of that is just, wishful thinking. How would you respond to that?
First of all, it's absurd. Secondly, go to Joggins. I've told people where to go and where to look, and they can go and see it for themselves. And I am not the only one to document this. Harold Coffin documented the negative geotropism. John Mackay, also, who's a geologist who has spent a lot of time at Joggins, at least as much as I have, maybe more. John has also documented the negative geotropism. Harold Coffin also documented inverted polystrate stumps. John Mackay documented them as well. I figure it was probably 1 in 100 would be a quick guess. So, I mean, that's a ridiculous accusation. And I mean, This is the picture right here. Now, unfortunately, this has fallen out of the cliff, so you can't go and look at this one. But this is just a classic example, and you can see the root for yourself. Here it is. Just trace it out. And here it is again.
Yeah.
It continues on. In fact, it continues on off the photograph. It even carries on farther than what I photographed. But this was my first year ever at Joggins. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. In fact, I walked by this stump 3 days before I saw it. And this is one which also has an inverted stump upside down buried underneath it. And there's it had fallen out of the cliff. But again, you can see the roots. And the negative geotropism, the roots are actually coming up above what would have been ground level.
Yeah.
Which is a major point.
So it's not in situ, basically.
That's one of the reasons for saying it's not in situ. Correct. Yeah.
Now, another thing that I've had skeptics say to me is, why is it that only trees and these giant lycopsids are ever found polystrate? Why don't we find other things polystrate if it's a real phenomenon? My understanding is that that's simply not true, and that we do find other things besides trees polystrate. What do you know about that?
Yeah, and that gets tricky. The reason being is because how many layers does it have to cross for it to be considered polystrate, for example?
Well, I would say one.
What's that?
I would say just if it's in more than one layer, that's it. That's polystrate. But
yeah, true. And if you're arguing from the perspective of these layers do require at least, say, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. I'm just trying to be kind of fair about the debate, right?
Yeah.
But there are others, and I can't think of any right now. But and especially because the plant fossils are the ones that have caught my attention the most, or I've spent the most time studying. One that does come to mind, Green River Formation. You will actually, if you go to the quarries there, John Mackay was the one that pointed this out. You can go to the quarry and you can quarry your own fossil fish. Well, you also occasionally find fossil fish poop, coprolites.
Yes.
And the coprolites are polystrate.
Yeah.
So, okay, is this the worst case of constipation we've seen in the fossil record? What's going on there? And of course, that's much more fragile than a plant or even an animal. And for it to be preserved polystrate. So again, this is some place that people can go. It's a public quarry. You can go there. You can excavate yourself. Go see for yourself.
Well, my goal is for us to really hit head on and try to, I don't want to straw man anyone. I don't want to misrepresent what the skeptics have to say. And I see that we have some of them here tonight. I hope they'll join us right now on the open mic so we can, get to the bottom of this, as it were. But yeah, I mean, this is a great opportunity to address these types of arguments.
Very good, gentlemen. I'm glad I'm on the same team as you, Ian and Paul. I wouldn't want to be a skeptic facing this evidence for young Earth creation based on polystrate fossils. So let's get some of these questions up here. Apologize if my voice leaves me at times. I'm getting over a cold here. So first question or objection. We've hosted a lot of debates. We've engaged the critics on this, and they've frequently asked, why do we never find polystrate fossils in layers that scientists claim are millions of years apart? What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Well, I would ask, is that true, first of all? Because, how do you know what we find? But I would also say, is it possible that if we did find such a thing, the scientists wouldn't be claiming that they were millions of years apart? You see what I'm saying? Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, that's kind of what I would say as well, because I'm not quite following the question.
I think they're saying, like, why don't we find polystrate, fossils in Grand Canyon that cross these hundreds of millions barriers, whereas at Joggins, they're saying the whole thing was only a century. So that's not very impressive because that's only 100 years. Well, wait a minute. Why are they saying that it's only 100 years?
And especially when one considers, like, they were only, I'm assuming Calder was only referring to the classic Joggins section there. But let's say that's the case. When you take a look, I mean, you got to remember the Joggins fossil cliffs we're talking about here. It's between, depending on who you ask and where you start measuring and when you stop measuring, it's somewhere between 15 and 20,000 vertical feet thick. So it's So if you want to sum all that up and say that happened in a century, okay, I'm okay with that. Are you willing to accept that?
They want to say that each lycopsid was a century, but then they want to say that the whole formation was.
Oh, okay. I see.
A certain number of millions of years, but each lycopsid, that was a century. So it's kind of this shell game of where are the millions of years? You know, anytime you find a polystrate fossil, well, guess what? That wasn't millions of years. That was a century, right? But then in other places, all of a sudden, we're talking hundreds of millions of years. So I don't think it's a fair question, because I think it's a loaded. I think they can just decide pretty much. This is historical science. So, you know, it goes back to the whole, you know, we don't have a time machine. So it's not fair to blame us for the fact that they have, you know, shifting and non-objective ways of determining how much strata, how many feet of strata would represent how many millions of years. You know, there's no single answer to that. So because of that, it's a moving goalpost.
Yeah. Yeah, those are some good points, gentlemen. Do you think this one is fair? A fair argument comes in from Lorraine. She says, you will never see a polystrate that has roots in the Carboniferous and extends to the Permian. It's kind of more along the lines of what we've been addressing. But again, is this moving the goalpost? Is this not really a fair challenge? Go ahead.
Well, I would ask Lorraine, let's assume that the global flood happened. Now you tell me why I should find that. Assuming the global flood did happen. Why should we expect to find that? I don't know of a reason.
I would also jump in that we may actually, that may still be there.
Sure.
And this doesn't quite go to the Permian, but pretty close. Not far from Joggins on the other side of the Bay of Fundy is Blue Beach, which is also, I believe they also designated that as a protected site as well now. And that beach is plastered with fossil footprints, but it also has a whole mess of polystrate fossils going through those layers, which have the fossil trackways. That rock is stratigraphically lower than Joggins. So I think we would all agree that it was older, whether it was hours older or millions of years older. Fine, I'll leave it up to you. But I think we would all agree that those layers are older. And it was over at Blue Beach where they found that very famous fossil trail of footprints. One of them was mentioning, you know, why don't we find mammals, for example? Actually, let's do one better than that. Over by Blue Beach and just northeast of there, Dawson himself found fossil bird tracks. And the fossil trackways that that became very famous, they were discovered in the early 70s. And they actually have a cast of it on display in the museum in Halifax. But the trackway is still there on the beach. You can go and see it at low tide and study yourself. And it's the most unusual trail. It's clearly a bipedal animal. With very strange C-shaped footprints in a right, left pattern. You can see that the footprints, the feet were being swept by water. And bearing in mind that these layers, that this particular layer with the fossil footprints has polystrate fossil plants buried through it, going through it. And yet the water was moving with such force that it was actually moving the feet of this creature as it was walking. And I eventually identified that creature as an ostrich. Ostrich have unique feet, and that is an ostrich trail. What on earth is a trail of ostrich footprints doing in rock layers older than the Carboniferous by the evolutionists' own standards? And Dawson's bird tracks, which are very clearly just they look like seabirds. It was published in a geology magazine in the 50s. I don't have the reference on hand, I'm afraid. But that was Dawson that found that. And when they showed the photograph in the publication, they said it looks just like footprints of wading birds, but clearly it can't be that of wading birds. Why not?
Yeah.
If it's clearly, can you identify an animal by its footprints? Absolutely. Go and talk to any Indian tracker. Not only can they identify the track maker, they can tell you what it was doing when it made its footprints. So absolutely, you can identify a creature by its footprints. Anyway, so that was just a couple of. How do we wind up on that rabbit trail?
Yeah, well,
it's a good rabbit trail.
I'm blaming you.
I think Dr. Duff had brought up footprints or trackways during the, in his.
I could pull that up. It's right here. We do have a good fair share of skeptics and critics, those that have written on the topic, those that have put out videos on the topic, like Gutsy Gibbon. So we certainly have a lot to go through here, which is good because we're leaving no stone unturned on polystrate fossils. Now, in light of the fact that we do have plenty of objections and arguments to deal with here in the form of comments, for any critic or skeptic who wants to join and engage directly, I do have the StreamYard link posted and pinned for you to join, as long as we keep it respectful and professional, of course. So, Paul, did you want to address Dr. Joel Duff here? He says the footprints, so he's coming at your argument here by saying the footprints defeat your argument about the Joggins trees. If you have footprints between each polystrate layer, then that is proof that they were laid down in separate time with enough and it cut off. Any thoughts on that?
I don't believe anybody said that there were footprints found between each polystrate layer. I'm not sure anybody said that, first of all.
I kind of said that.
But not in the same. See, that's the problem, is that if I'm understanding all of this correctly, these layers are sorted by the properties of the substance that makes up that layer. And so you might have one section here that was laid down at time T1, and it's got the polystrate tree. But then come over here. Let's think back to that presentation that we just saw, the drama in the rocks. And they showed how at a point in time, you're actually going to have all of those exposed at the same point in time, and they're still actively forming. Now, if that occurs, time T1 over here is not the same as time T2 over here. The point I'm trying to get at is, yes, you absolutely can have exposed sections of those strata in a different location. I don't think anybody was saying that we found footprints between polystrate layers right up next to a lycopsid. I don't think that anybody said anything like that. So,
and even if we did, we're talking about a time span of, we would say, hours.
Yeah, hours. So yeah, who knows? Maybe the lycopsid did stand upright for a couple hours and then continue to get buried. I don't know. That's the problem, is that we're not talking about millions of years. We're talking about hours or days as the flood rose. And remember, don't forget, we have the beds model, briefly exposed diluvial sediments. So global flood didn't happen in the blink of an eye. It was a process. And throughout this process of the rising floodwaters, you would have had moments of abatement. And during those moments of abatement, you would have had opportunity for trackways to be made, dinosaurs to lay little nests of eggs, things like that. And then it would turn around and get covered up rapidly.
Yeah.
I don't see it as a problem for the model.
It's a great point.
Yeah. And if I may jump in on that as well with Dr. Duff's comment. So if we head out to Grand Cache, Alberta, I went there because I had heard, everyone told me about these fossil dinosaur tracks out there. And there was a lot of them. So I went there to study the dinosaur tracks and stumbled upon a whole mess of polystrate fossils, which really caught me by surprise. and I'm a catastrophist, and this caught me by surprise. I don't know how well this might show up on your screens. Yeah, it's pretty hard to see. Can you guys see these? These are dinosaur tracks. Can you?
Yes,
make those
I
out?
could. Yeah.
Like you can see the 3 toes there on that one. So there are varying types of dinosaur tracks. Also notice the wave ripples. Very interesting. But this is the kind of layering that you see there. So what's happened, all these layers were laid down. They're now tilted up almost sheer vertical. And there was these thick coal seams on top of these layers. They've mined away the coal seams. So the coal is gone. It's now exposing the dinosaur tracks. And I was there going through the mines with a young geologist there. And we kept seeing these strange depressions. But I mean, they're way up at the cliff. We couldn't get to them. And there was a lot of them, like dozens at least. So this whole surface is just peppered with wave ripples and dinosaur tracks. And there's another one right there, another one of these strange depressions. And we finally found one at ground level. If I can get to it, there's a close-up of it. And we got to one at ground level, if I can find it. Come on, where is it? It's getting closer. I can sense it. Oh, good grief. Let me see if I can find the thumbnails here. Dear.
At that, I'll just mention that, you know, this whole thing, we're sitting here sifting through these clues, and we're trying to come up with a plausible explanation. What we're doing here is abductive reasoning, inference to the best explanation. So none of our belief in the flood ultimately is based on God's testimony. First of all, that's where it comes from. That's why we believe it happened, not because we're so smart that we can piece it all together ourselves. But then when we do look at the evidence, we can use abductive reasoning to say, okay, this is the best explanation for what we see. So go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, and I just noticed Dr. Duff was commenting as well, like down in Bolivia, which has dino tracks on at least 8 separate layers stacked on top of each other. Yes, except in this case, oh my goodness, it's a lot. It's a lot more than 8. But here's the catch. So we finally find one of these depressions at ground level, and it was actually the geologist who pointed this out. There it is right there. It was an upside down buried polystrate plant, and it was hollow. I couldn't identify because we couldn't excavate, and I couldn't see far down enough to see if it was like lepidodendron or something like that. But it was hollow like the lycopods, and it was infilled, and it was coalified. And they were all upside down with apparently the roots extending up into the coal, which has since been mined away. So now we've got multiple layers of dinosaur tracks, which deep time thinkers would claim were seasonal, migration back and forth. But cutting down through who knows how many of these tracks, these layers of dinosaur tracks, you have upside down polystrate buried plants, roots up, cutting through all of these layers with dinosaur tracks. Clearly, that tree, first of all, how does that even happen? How do you wind up with a bunch of trees or plants buried upside down? Well, that happens with a catastrophe. And obviously, this didn't happen. I mean, this causes problems for everybody, I think. But it definitely causes problems for the seasonal migration interpretation of the dinosaur tracks. But this is one example, and there was dozens of them. That's what blew me away. I did not go there expecting to find polystrate fossils, and I certainly didn't expect to find dozens of polystrate trees buried upside down through the stratigraphic layers. Anyway,
that's fascinating, and I think you made a good point that there are going to be things that all sides struggle to explain because we weren't there. We can't repeat the global flood. We can't really watch and see what happened. So there are going to be assumptions that we're making that turn out to be wrong assumptions. And that's true across the board. But I think if you look at the overall scope of the evidence all over the planet, it's greatly more indicative of the Bible's history than it is what we would expect to find if deep time and evolution were true. And I don't understand the skeptics who are saying that dinosaur tracks are in their favor, because it seems pretty obvious to anybody applying any critical thinking that dinosaur tracks in mud are not going to sit around and wait to be fossilized. They're going to get eroded rather rapidly. What is this mechanism that is supposed to be preserving dinosaur tracks in a uniformitarian gradualist paradigm? Ian, are you even aware of any credible explanation that a uniformitarian has tried to give on dinosaur tracks?
Just the usual mantra of it takes time, the mud has to harden and stuff like that. Honestly, I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how's the mud
really
like?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really paid any attention because
where do we see that? Where can we go see that happening today? Where can we use operational science and see tracks that are remaining completely undisturbed for not centuries, but thousands of years, and then on into millions of years to get slowly, I don't know, somehow fossilized, even though there was no sediment, like no rapid burial. The idea doesn't make sense. So maybe if one of these skeptics like Dr. Duff would like to get on and explain to us what their mechanism is for preserving these fine impressions of ripples and dinosaur tracks that don't require catastrophic burial, I would like to hear what it is.
And also, if I, Donny, Jackson Rowe here,
yes,
just commented, Calamites regenerated in the episodically accruing sediment. Okay, I thought that was all one word. I was like, oh, that's a really long word. Accruing sediment around the dead and dying lycopsid stands.
There we go.
Thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to bring up Calamites because we're always talking about the lycopods. The at least as common, maybe more common than the lycopods of Joggins are the Calamites. So most of the lycopods have relatively intact roots, sometimes extensively intact roots, complete with rootlets. Sometimes the rootlets are stripped off, sometimes the roots are stripped off. But most of them have intact roots, but not the Calamites, which are buried in the exact same layers as the lycopods. I have yet to find a fossil Calamites with intact roots at Joggins. And there's a lot of them. But also, when Jackson mentioned regenerating Calamites, I don't know what this is from, so I'd have to look up the quote and find the paper and everything. But I would immediately question the interpretation of that. And let me give you an example of why. This is Robert Gastaldo published this paper in 1992. And in it, he claimed this is fossil Calamites. And in it, he claimed that it actually regenerated and grew new roots at different levels through the strata. And so it's a really lousy picture. But it was the best I could get. Can you see that, Donny, on my screen? Or can you guys see
yes. It? Yeah, I got it up now.
Okay. So what he's pointing to here is these here, which he is claiming are roots. And so as this Calamites grew and the layers of mud buried it, it grew new layers of roots or new levels of roots along the stem in response to its burial over time. John Mackay and myself both took one look at this and we said that is an upside down Calamites. But because of Gastaldo's assumptions, it's polystrate, it's in situ. Therefore, these must be roots. They're not roots, they're branches. It's been buried upside down. You will not find a modern day example of calamites growing roots at different sections on its stem. It just does not happen. And these things can go quite deep too. The modern day calamites, they're still around today, just a lot smaller. But those roots can go way down. Why aren't they growing roots at different levels if they're going so deep into the ground? But again, Gestaldo, because of his deep time mindset, he looked at this, said, this is clearly in situ, therefore these are roots. No, it's not. It's an upside down polystrate fossil calamites. Anyway, get me off of rabbit trails again.
No, these are great rabbit trails. This is fascinating, Ian. I love how comprehensive it is. Dr. Duff gives you a compliment on your presentation. So we appreciate that, Joel. And he says this about the calamites, that it has an extremely small root system, scouring rush, and grows in wet areas, has nearly no root system, just enough to hold itself up. Did you want to speak to that, Ian?
No, that's a fair argument. I'd accept that. Yeah. I would still expect to see even a small root system though. And I mean, I've oh my goodness, I've lost count of how many I've looked at. You can often find the root balls, but there's no roots. They're just gone. I have yet to find one. So, I mean, and by the way, I don't think we mentioned this yet. If any of you guys get the chance, go to Joggins. It's well worth the trip. What did we figure you were, how far a drive were you, Paul? 25 hours, something like that?
Much further than I'm likely to make. I know that.
Come on, we'll make a date. We'll go there. Come on. But go to Joggins. Look at it yourself. You can study it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Go. And go year after year after year, because it is constantly, I don't think we mentioned this as well, but because of the Bay of Fundy, the tides are constantly eroding the cliffs. Every year is new fossils, which is unfortunate because the ones you just looked at are now gone. They get destroyed, and quite quickly. But at the same time, every year reveals new fossils. So anyway, I just say, hey, everyone, go.
Yeah, and for the skeptics and the evolutionists, the fact that what you just said, Ian, how quickly the fossils are lost, should give people pause when they make claims like, well, if your global flood is true, then why don't we find X, Y, or Z in exactly this place? It should give people pause who use those types of arguments, because number one, there's only a limited number of people out there actually excavating, actually documenting things. And number two, how do you know what we've missed? How do you know what got destroyed the week before the scientists got there? And unfortunately, I have to say, how do you know what things that the scientists didn't choose to document because of their assumptions? Just like what we saw with the soft tissue, with people like Mary Schweitzer, Mark Armitage, so on and so forth, they are discovering things that previous generations of scientists were not even looking for because of their assumptions. And do you think that's not just true for soft tissue? That's true across the board. If you have an assumption that this must be formed via gradualistic processes, then that is going to shape the type of excavation that you do, the type of things that you consider to be important or anomalous, or so on and so forth. And look what happened to look what happens to people who dare to try to put forth evidence. Look what happens to these people. If I'm a well-to-do scientist, do you think I want to get my name posted on the internet as a kook and a creationist for putting up some ridiculous looking fossil that defies evolution? Or am I going to keep it to myself and say, I don't understand that. Let's let's circle back to that, so to speak. So there are so many issues here. There are so many reasons that I think people should have pause when they make these sweeping generalizations about the fossil record.
I agree. And so this is Gutsick Gibbon here. I appreciate the comment. If I'm not mistaken, Gutsick put out a video titled something like Polystrate Fossils Preclude Young Earth Creation. And so she puts forth a lot of these arguments that we see people utilizing. And you guys just addressed regenerative growth. She says, so basically she's compiled all these for us. And I believe they're directly from her video on the topic. Rootlet presence, analogous conditions to modern floodplains. I've seen that one come up several times. Did you gentlemen want to speak to these as supposedly the best objections to what's being said today?
Hey, yeah, and tying in with that, if I can point to Iron Matt's comment, maybe I'll just read it because it kind of ties in with what Gutsick was saying. Iron Matt, by the way, hi Iron Matt. He hangs out.
Good to see you, Iron Matt.
That's the one. Thank you.
Yeah,
okay,
there we go. I got your back, brother.
Are there any examples of polystrate trees through coal layers or just in sedimentary rocks? So this kind of comes back to what Gutsick was, one of the things that Gutsick was mentioning, because, or maybe she didn't mention it. Soil horizons was another one of them. Modern floodplains, which I actually agree with. I totally agree that modern floodplains, I would say they were floodplains from tides, tidal bores during the onset of the global flood. So I have no problem with floodplains, with the interpretation of floodplains. And modern polystrate trees being buried. Okay, I'm assuming you're referring to the one that's that would be just east of Joggins. I know the guys at the Joggins Fossil Center sent me there, and we tried to get down there. We got stuck in the mud, and it was a glorious day. But anyway, but when you take a look at their alleged polystrate trees being buried in a floodplain, it's pathetic. There is no comparison at all. Go there and take a look. Okay, it's a bunch of trees that are dead and they're hollow and they're rotting, and they have absolutely no comparison to the Joggins fossil plants, like none, zero. And they're not even being buried in situ. That's the thing. They're a bunch of dead trees in a stand is what it is in a swamp. But coming back to Iron Matt's question, yes, polystrate trees do go through coal seams, but in the early days, I haven't heard this argument in quite a while, but one of the arguments the skeptics brought up was that the fossil forest horizons were always found in coal layers, which is not true. In fact, the alleged soil horizons that fossil forest horizons that they claim, sometimes it's coal, sometimes it's sandstone, sometimes it's shale, and the trees will go through all of those kinds of layers. And again, go to Joggins and see it for yourself. Just bring a helmet. With the erosion, you can die real quick if you're getting up there to examine the layers up close, which you should. But unfortunately, you're taking your life in your hands by doing that, because it's constantly shedding rock, and it doesn't take a very big rock to kill you or hurt you real bad. But anyway, so coming back to Iron Matt's comments, you will see the full gamut. You name it, you'll see it. Also, interestingly, John Mackay has pointed out, not just at Joggins, but all kinds of other places. One of John's specialties is coal seams. And he's pointed out a whole mess of coal seams that are a 1/4 inch thick. and even in Joggins you'll see them. And so he jokingly refers to these as 1/4-inch deep swamps, because that's allegedly where the coal came from, was swamps that were buried. Well, what is this, a 1/4-inch deep swamp? It doesn't make sense, but anyway.
It makes a lot of sense, though, if they were deposited rapidly according to the hydrologic sorting, like what we saw in those flume experiments. Makes a whole lot of sense then. And that's what I see when I look at all of these photos of the cliffs. I see the same type of patterns that we saw in the flume experiments formed rapidly as a result of the sorting mechanism in physics, basically. I did want to mention one quick thing that Dr. Duff had said way back. He said, why don't we find any polystrate fossils going, or do we find polystrate fossils going through different lithologies, I believe he said. And I just wanted to circle back to that, because if you remember back in the presentation, one of the arguments that the secularists gave for why this allegedly was not buried by a single flooding event was stacked packages of heterolithic strata. So yeah, even these ones that we're talking about right here are quote unquote heterolithic. And Ian, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I have a hard time understanding how you would interpret this heterolithic aspect in a gradualistic, scenario where we're in one place, one environment. We're appealing to this whole thing happened in 100 years, allegedly, but somehow you get totally different, like, composition of strata from these local flooding events. Where's that coming from? Where do you see completely different lithologies forming today in the same exact location over a period of years? I don't understand the mechanism there either.
Yeah, that was the first time I'd ever heard that quote from Calder, actually. So I can't comment on it. I'd have to go back and try and grapple with what exactly he's saying and claiming as well. Like, I don't know. I've never heard that term before, so I have no idea.
Yeah,
but I did notice.
Basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, he's just basically admitting that the composition of these strata are different, and obviously they're different, or they wouldn't be different colors. Like, we wouldn't be able to see them if they weren't different. So why are they different? As a young Earth creationist, I can explain why we see these stacked packages of heterolithic strata, because they're sorted by physics. That's why they're stacked. That's why they're heterolithic. And that's why they make these nice, perfectly straight lines. Now, I would like anybody to explain that to me using gradualism.
Right. I noticed too, Donny, you had. Oh, I'm sorry. What's that?
I said it seems like we don't have any takers tonight, but I would ask anybody.
Well, we do have our first taker, Jackson Rowe, always willing to take up the challenge, the debate challenge. So Jackson Jackson had several interesting questions over the last 15 minutes in the chat. He informed me he was going to join, so I figured we'd wait for a face-to-face interaction. Ian, I understand you were going to say something though first, brother. I want to give you that. It looked like you were going to point something out.
Oh, I was just the Doki pointed out John Mackay's 3D scan of the Polystrate tree in Tennessee, which I actually made a mold of that tree as well. And it's on display. Yeah, that's the one. It's on display at Creation Evidence Museum, actually, is one of the places. The Glendive Fossil Dinosaur and Fossil Center in Glendive, Montana as well. They've got a copy of that as well. That's a fascinating fossil because of the sedimentation, which is one of the reasons John and I, Paul, you had mentioned John Calder. Calder and, I've forgotten the other guy's name. They did a paper a number of years back called Vegetation-Induced Sedimentary Structures. And you can see all this going on with all the polystrates, and especially that one in Tennessee, where you can see cross bedding, you can see the layers thinning and thickening as the water was going across the tree. And as the water split, it accelerates and it carries away sediments. And on the other side, it slows down, it deposits them. So you can see all this very powerful evidence of catastrophic rapid burial and water movement on that particular fossil. But anyway,
that's great.
Trails again.
John Mackay, we love partnering with John Mackay. He and Joe Hubbard, they were here just about a month ago for an open mic debate. They did a fantastic job taking on the critics. And
actually,
in October,
Joe just went to that tree 2 weeks ago.
I
had to give him directions.
They're awesome. Yeah, we got a great team of Young Earth creationists, and they gave an excellent presentation like you brothers on polystrate fossils about a year and a half ago. We spent some time addressing the critics. So this really is one of those discriminatory pieces of evidence, as you said, Paul, that the evolutionary community really struggles with. And we've got several of my favorite skeptics, as a matter of fact, waiting to join the party. And so let's do what we typically do, as you know, Paul, is we'll have one guest who's directly engaging, and then one who's on deck. And so currently we'll have Jackson Rowe up, as he was first. I do see several Young Earth creationists as well backstage. We want to allow the skeptics to join first, since it is an open mic challenge, and then we'll end with questions from our fellow creationists. And so we'll have Dr. Duff, I appreciate you being here as well, on deck. And so let's start with Jackson. Jackson, real quick introduction. And then which point would you like to focus on first? Go ahead.
All right, what's going on? I'm Jackson Rowe, and I'm pretty into amateur fossil hunting. I actually was collecting a bunch of Carboniferous marine fossiliferous rocks a few days ago, piled like 100 pounds of it in this bin, dragged it up a hill to my car, which was a mistake. I swear I almost had a heart attack. I think but anyway, I just have a few questions. I found a lot of like Calamites fossils and a couple of lycopods here and there, but you always find those in the Carboniferous, and you never find something like an oak tree or a cypress tree, an acorn, anything like that. And that's just really unusual to me. If all these things existed in pretty much the same environments at the same time, you would think you'd find an oak tree standing next to a lycopod. Why would that not be the case?
Okay, good question. We actually do find them, and at Joggins especially. My brain has gone blank. I've forgotten the name of the tree. It's a type of pine tree, and there's a lot of them. What's intriguing about that, though, is the hollow plants, like the lycopods and the calamites, are almost always buried polystrate. And when you do find them prostrate, they've been flattened. The solid wood logs, the pine trees, which the name will come to me at 3 a.m. So I'll give you a call then. Okay.
Wallomy pine, is it?
No,
pine
not
have been around for quite a bit longer than oak trees.
Right. Right. And I'm simply pointing to other solid wood trees that are there. But I accept your point. I would have to question whether that's actually the case or not. I haven't found any. Obviously, you haven't. I haven't heard of any, but that doesn't mean it isn't out there. But the interesting thing is that the hollow plants were polystrate almost always, and the solid wood trees were prostrate. I've only ever found one that was it was a short chunk of log that was polystrate. Why was I saying that? Oh yeah, the pine trees.
It's just an interesting. It might have something more to do with, again, fluid dynamics. I would be interesting to see if we could reproduce that phenomenon in a flume. I don't know, but Jackson, I would answer you by saying, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that what you said is true, that we never find that in the fossil record together with that other plant. Okay? Assuming that is a given for a moment. Now, turning it back on me, you're asking me, why, like, or rather, I'm asking you, why should I expect to find that if the global flood happened? Why would that be discriminatory here?
Should you expect to find it?
Why you're implying that I should expect to find those two things together when I don't, and I'm
Well,
asking what the basis is for that.
Well, it's kind of assumed that lycopod trees and like a cypress tree would live in a similar environment. So ecologic zonation doesn't really work. It's kind of, I mean, I would think they have similar density, so I don't know how hydrologic sorting would sort
Well,
them
but
out.
the ecological zonation thing, you're basing that on what?
The type of environments their cypress trees live in, and
But how
trees.
much does anybody know about the existing ecological biomes and environments that existed 4,500 years ago before Noah's flood, before the entire crust of the earth was recycled and everything changed on this planet? How do you know that the assumptions you're making about ecological zonation based on what we see today, how do you know that holds in a pre-flood situation?
Well, I was reading a paper about the Mason Creek site, and there's at least one polystrate lycopod tree there, and they assume it's a delta based on the silt in one section, and it kind of gets more granular as it goes out to the ocean, or what was the ocean at the time. So they can, just looking at the makeup of the geology, they can kind of infer what kind of environment it was.
And a lot of creationists as well claim ecological zonation as an explanation for the alleged sorting of the fossil record too. I think that's probably what you're getting at as well.
Yeah, yes. And we already saw that that's exactly the explanation that evolutionists use to explain why the coelacanth disappeared for 70 or 80 million years out of the fossil record. So, I mean, I don't see how that, if that argument is against the global flood, then it also is against the opposite of the global flood. So it doesn't really get us anywhere, because both sides have stuff missing from where we would expect to find it. And the fossil record has ghost lineages, we have missing lineages. So yeah, both sides have anomalous observations that we don't, like unanswered questions. Why do we see, or why don't we see something that we don't see,
Well, I think a lone example like the coelacanth, I mean, there were in the Devonian, and I know there's some from the Cretaceous. I don't know how much more recent they get than that. But if looking at the whole body of the fossil record and you don't find certain things next to each other, so to speak, I think it gets pretty compelling for a deep time scenario, and creationism starts to not make so much sense when you really look like the hundreds, thousands of species throughout the fossil record that are not found together anywhere.
And if I may suggest as well, I don't know what Dr. Duff wants to bring up, but I do notice his comment about it's not just the trees, it's a large number of organisms one would expect to live together ecologically. So were you going to bring that up, Dr. Duff? No? Okay. Is it okay if I bring it up? Okay. Because this kind of ties in with Jackson's point. Because, okay, let's take that and run with it for a minute. So just at Joggins, you've got the lycopods and the pine trees and the calamites, a bunch of different plants. You've also got fishes that are buried in the same layers. You've got fossil clam layers that they call them coal clam layers. There's so many clams, and it's all turned to coal. There's coal clam layers. You find there's been a fossil scorpion uncovered there. There's been fossil damselflies there. There's been the Arthropleura, of course. So you get a variety of the flying creatures, fishes, clams, underwater organisms, all buried together with plants. How does that? If we're looking at ecological zonation, what on earth are you doing with a scorpion in a swamp with lycopods and calamites and stuff. So there's huge questions about the whole ecology and what you would expect or not expect to see. Anyway, thought I'd throw that in. So
Ian, Jackson, just to make sure we have enough time to address everybody.
Yeah.
Should we move on to Dr. Duff now? And then we've got another couple backstage. Unless Jackson, there was a final thing you wanted to say or point?
Yeah, I'll drop out. You can just put Dr. Duff on here.
All right, Jackson, I appreciate you joining. So
we got 20, 30 more minutes to go here, Donnie. So let's, let's see.
Yeah, so let me do, okay, perfect. And now we have Joel directly interacting on deck. We've got Org. So we got a good group of skeptics, well qualified individuals. So Dr. Duff, appreciate you being here. Certainly not your first time here on one of our Standing for Truth open mics. So I do appreciate your interaction. Joel, how you doing tonight? Real quick intro, and what would you like to discuss?
Yeah, I'm doing great. And thanks, gentlemen, for this really interesting conversation. And I'll keep it short. I just wanted to, Paul had brought up something about, the footprints and was asking about like, how could those footprints be preserved? And I think that he brings up a very natural, I think a natural idea that many people have, right? I mean, I think everybody experiences, you walk on a beach, you walk even on mud and you see your footprints and they're going to be washed away. I mean, they're not going to survive. And so I hear that all the time. They can't be preserved. Like, how else would they be preserved? And maybe a global flood would instantly preserve them by covering them as soon as that they are laid down. But there are billions of fossil footprints, right? Not just in the flood record, but in the post-flood record. Now, I don't know what your exact position is on where the flood, post-flood boundary is. I know that there's lots of debate among younger creationists, but even if you have it in the, I'd say a high flood or a high boundary marker, I would still say that there are many billions of fossil footprints that are present in post-flood rocks. So we know that a non-global flood situation can preserve fossil footprints, including humans. So I've been to Death Valley, and there was there's sand dunes at the bottom of the Death Valley in one area, and you can see where a large sand dune is blowing away, and below it is this mud substrate which is hardened, and on that I saw a whole trackway of like 20 boot prints. Now I don't know when those boot prints are laid down, but it could have been years before, and then the sand covered them up and they're leaving. And then that sand's probably going to cover them again, and then it gets wet, and then there's more deposition. Potentially someday, those boot prints could end up being in the fossil record. Now, 99.9999999% of all the footprints that we would ever lay down, that any of us or any animal would ever step on the earth and do anything with, they're going to be eroded, no doubt about it. But all it takes is 0.0000001% of footprints to survive under some condition, even if it's a fairly rare condition, for us to have billions of footprints present in the fossil record without floods, without global floods, even without local floods. There are human footprints that have been found on sand dunes that are preserved in South Africa, in Spain, in the Southwest. And if you go to the White Sands National Monument, surely you've heard of the fossil footprint tracks there, where we have traced a person who has walked, thousands of footprints, walked back and met a sloth, or didn't actually, in that case, not met a sloth, but a sloth passed over that particular trackway. And we think that happened thousands of years ago, and yet their footprints are there readily for us to see. So the argument that, footprints will just get washed away, there needs to be some sort of really quick preservation of it, is not really accurate. Yes, there need to be some preservation. You usually have to step in some sort of mud, which has to be consolidated enough for you to actually leave the footprint to begin with. And then you're going to have, if it dries out, as you have in seasonal places where you have a springtime flood or springtime wetland, and then when the floods come back or the water returns, it's going to bring a little bit of sediment, fill up those layers. That's how I would also visualize those dinosaur footprints being preserved as well. You find on these thin layers, and I recognize that I mean, Ian, I think that's a, I think your title, idea would have some merit there in terms of like, look, you've got this washing in and out and over this particular set of footprints that are laid down. I think the one negative there would be if that's on sand. Well, sand can consolidate fairly quickly, and you can step on it like we can walk on a beach, right? But if it's on mud, if it's on mudstone, if you have mud, a dinosaur stepping in the mud isn't going to leave a very clear footprint. They're just going to sink into it. In a global flood scenario, you're going to have a large swaths of dense material that's not dewatered, and therefore it's going to be hard to hold sort of hold the weight of the animals walking on it. So that's one particular challenge, and that's a challenge that I think most of has come out in the young Earth creationist literature itself recently, with that particular challenge of how do the muds get consolidated in order for these footprints to be preserved. But anyway, that's really my only thing, is to just let people know that there are enormous numbers of footprints of all different types that are found throughout the fossil record. Although there is a pattern to it. I mean, there's certain kinds of footprints that aren't found deep in the fossil record, but we have abundant evidence that virtually every organism that's on this earth has the potential to leave footprints in the fossil record. Although, because if you have a population of 1 million individuals, they're going to make trillions of footprints. So only a few of them need to be preserved for us to see them someday.
Okay, Joel, I appreciate that. Paul, Ian, we'll give you as much time as you need to respond.
I just wanted to ask him about the Death Valley footprints. Can I find them? I haven't been there yet.
Well, I don't know. Maybe they're eroded, but they're in the and the thing is, they're in the area just I forget what the name of that is, but it's where the big sand dunes are. And then there's a area of sand stovepipe wells. I think it's the parking lot stovepipe wells. Yes. Okay. And you walk out there and you kind of meet where the sand dunes are kind of meeting where the land is. And they're kind of just moving around all the time. They're sort of like uncovering some plants, and then you'll see some of those. They're really cool plants there, right? Because they have their roots are way down in there, but then they get all the sand blown out from underneath them, and they're kind of standing on stilts. So
cool. Okay, cool.
Well, there's your, there'll be polystrate fossils some days, I guess. If they keep getting covered, and then they grow a little higher, and then they keep getting covered, and they try to grow up a little higher. And they're really tough plants, so they're not going to be killed off by a single, a storm of sand covering them up.
Right.
I have a question for Dr. Duff real quick.
Thank you.
So you brought up the white sands fossil footprints. And apparently this is something I hadn't heard about, so I'm interested to look more into this myself. But,
super cool.
Yeah, it says they're fossilized human footprints. And so understanding,
fossilized is with quotes around it.
So what do we mean? This is my question: is what is your proposed method of preservation here? Like, what is the explanation you have for how? Like, what does it mean to say that these are fossilized footprints? How are they preserved?
Well, in that case, you have that's a very flat lake bed there. And you had times where you had thousands of acres covered by very thin amount of water during the spring floods that come down from the mountain, because that place is just surrounded by mountains, and it all just gets trapped there, right? There's no exit to that. And so as that water dries up, you have this mud flat, and we can see that somebody walked from one side where they had, an above the water level, I would say, one area where a little higher elevation where they were apparently living or doing something, right? They had a camp. And then they walked across this mud flat all the way over to the other side where there was, again, higher elevation in order to, and the actual, the proposal is that because of the way that this individual, they think was a female, the way the footprints work is there's a more deeper impression from the left side than the right. I can't remember if it's right or left, but it suggests that she was carrying a baby or carrying some kind of weight on one side, because then the footprints come back across to the other side again. So the return trip, And in that case, it looks like the same person because the footprints are the same size, but they're not set into the soil the same amount. And so it looks like they dropped something off and then came back. And then on the trip out, there wasn't a sloth, but on the trip back, there was sloth's footprints that stepped on one of the human footprints and kept on going. And then when she came back, she stepped over that particular spot. So it's a
Yeah, I
really
mean,
interesting recreation of the historical events there. Now I know you're asking about like how do they get preserved? Well, I mean, that mud dries up through the dry summer, right? And hardens. And then next year you get all this sand and silt that comes in with the dirty, muddy water that comes in, and then it settles out on top of those footprints and leaves another 2 or 3 inches of sediment there. And see, they have footprints not just from one level; they have footprints from multiple different layers. There's one site I haven't made a video about it yet. But there's one site where there's like 6 different layers of sediment, and there's footprints on different layers. So this is a place where people lived, and every season they ended up walking on that same area on the same mud that's there.
And to be honest, for all I know, the explanation you're giving there would be agreed on by all parties, because
Yeah, I think so. Because
this
it's
is
post-flood.
this would definitely be post-flood in any case. But
Yeah.
it's just interesting because water has to be involved. Everyone agrees that water has to be involved because that's what permineralization requires. It requires the, infiltration of minerals that are dissolved in water to permeate something. So, even if the mud dries out, that in itself does not produce a fossil, because all you'll get is a cracked, a cracked hard piece of mud that is brittle. You would still need an additional process to
Oh,
turn
yeah.
hardened mud into an actual fossil, and that process still requires water. So everyone seems to agree that the fossil record was laid down by water. We're just only thing we're disagreeing on is the time it took to do it.
Yeah, in this case, no one's claiming that these footprints are in rock. I mean, these are in lithified soils at this point, right? There is some lithification going on. It's harder than just, it was muddy yesterday. You can't just take your shovel out there and dig through this. It takes some real, work to get at these different layers. The idea would be that this is still a basin. There's still more sediment that's being deposited there, and it's going to continue to deposit. I don't know, over tens of thousands of years, there could be dozens of feet, if not hundreds of feet of sediment on top of what are these preserved footprints underneath them. You're right, as water filters through all that and the whole set of sediments becomes lithified, eventually that could be rock, in which case someday there'll be footprints discovered in the rock. That's why I'd suggest looking at the South African example or the one in Spain, because those are preserved sand dunes that are rock. I mean, they're hard rock, and yet you can see human footprints in that sand dune. Somebody stepped on that sand dune when it was wet, left their impression, the sand dune dried, and then more sand blew over the top and then filled in those footprints, and then more sand piled on top of that till you eventually had an entire preserved sand dune system that then turned into rock. And now as it's eroding, we see those human footprints come out.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing is illustrating the point I tried to make earlier, which is that what we're approaching this, in historical science, we're looking at the present clues and we're trying to piece together what we believe the past events were. And there's no question that with any particular piece of evidence, you can come up with an explanation that fits the timescale you're looking at, or that you want it to use to explain it. But I think what Ian and I are arguing tonight is that not that there's any one particular piece of evidence that proves that the Bible's history about the global flood is true, and it's like a magic bullet piece of evidence. It's a smoking gun, as Dr. Carol Cleland said. I think the argument really is that you get an overall picture. When you look at the full picture, that is more indicative of the Bible's history than it is with Charles Lyell's history and James Hutton's history and Charles Darwin's history. And that's the argument that I think we're making here tonight. It's not that we're trying to show a gotcha. Well, see, this proves the Bible because we found a polystrate fossil. It's rather, look at the overall scope of evidence, and I think you see overwhelming evidence of a global flood. And honestly, my opinion is that if it weren't for the spiritual ramifications behind that claim, there wouldn't be a scientist on this planet that would have a problem with it. They would readily admit it. In fact, they're talking about, looks like maybe, I forget whether it was Mars. It might have been Mars. It looks like there was evidence for a global flood on Mars. And then they start talking about the same lines of evidence that we creationists use to show a global flood here on Earth. And they got no problem applying it to Mars. But on Earth, it doesn't work because on Earth, that would have spiritual ramifications that people don't want. And Ian, I want to make sure I'm not taking away any chance for you to speak. I know I don't want to talk over you, but do you have anything you want to add?
Nope. Other than if you're going to dig down with a shovel to the footprints, do it fast and run because they get real mad at you when you do that.
Yes. I've tried to go there. You're right. That site is not accessible.
Okay.
Yes, I very much wanted to see those.
Gentlemen, if
Paul, I need to say
ahead,
something
Paul.
really quick. I'll make it really quick. Well, that's all good and well. That was well beyond anything that I was interested in talking about. I only had one point, and that was you talked about the footprints in the fossil record, and you made this statement about how else could those footprints have been formed other than a global flood? You were trying to ascribe the footprints to like necessitating a global flood. All I'm doing is providing examples of footprints not produced in a global flood or in a flood of any manner, really. And that's the totality. That's the totality of my point, just so that you won't say that as if that's some kind of like great point for young Earth creationism. That is a wash. Like I would say, it doesn't help your case to say that. It just makes it look like you don't know about how footprints can be preserved. That's all. That's all. The only reason I'm here.
Okay, I mean it's an interesting point that you can point to some examples where specific
Billions of examples.
Circumstances allowed for footprints to be preserved in the absence of a catastrophic, flood, and that point is well taken. But I'm not sure that the specific circumstances, like at White Sands, that you're appealing to in this case, I don't think you would be able to make a very good argument that those circumstances would be applicable, for example, at Joggins. And so while you might be able to point to some isolated places where we've seen
isolated
formation of a footprint, I mean, your point is, it almost never happens, but because we're assuming billions of years of history, the 0.000001 unlikely event suddenly becomes likely, right? And that's kind of the MO of evolution, no matter what the situation is, whether we're talking about mutations or, footprints or whatever. It's always, it's unlikely, but we've got all the time in the world to play with, so the unlikely becomes inevitable. So,
thanks, Donnie. I got to run.
All right, my pleasure, Joel. Thank you for joining. Very interesting.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, so we got two more skeptics to go through here, Org and also Grayson. So we got Org directly engaging and Grayson on deck. So, okay, Org, good to have you. You're certainly no stranger to these open mics, that's for sure. So how you doing? And which point would you like to engage Paul and Ian on?
Yep. I'll be quick. I know you got a long line here and Paul's short on time. My background is in the geosciences. So while I don't work there anymore, I am familiar with these subjects. Just getting that out there. I posed this question to Kent Hovind, and if you guys already addressed it, I missed it. I apologize. Why aren't polystrate trees more common given your model? Why would only a few trees in the grand scope of trees on the planet end up being fossilized in that way, when I would imagine trees are all over the place, as opposed to, let's say, my model, which says they're isolated events, so we'd only have isolated pockets of polystrate trees.
Ian, do you want to go first?
I'm not quite following the question.
So
He's asked-
every tree, I'll expand a little bit. Every tree essentially was destroyed at once by Noah's flood, right? Well, over the course of a month or whatever, right?
Sure, yeah.
But polystrate trees only appear in like little teeny clumps in isolated places throughout the world. What happened to every single other tree that died, and why did only those little clumps turn polystrate and all the other trees didn't?
Okay, so I would have to disagree with the premise, because, I mean, like the Joggins, for example, it isn't just Joggins. That extends right out to certainly Cape Breton. I'm thinking it even extends over to Newfoundland. I'd have to double check that one, but certainly we're talking 500 kilometers, just that one patch. Then you've got Colorado, New Mexico, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Alaska. Not many of them here in Canada, because a huge chunk of Canada is Canadian Shield. But I mean, it's not a small amount, is what.
Well,
I'm getting
compared to trees on the planet, it really is, right? I mean, and that's the issue I have, is if one event simultaneously did all of the polystrate trees, simultaneously being, months or years or whatever, but
Sure.
in such a short time window, all these polystrate layers were deposited. Why did some trees not get the same action that others did?
So, Org, I would challenge your assumption that we would expect to find a lot of them. Even at Joggins, we don't find polystrate trees. At Joggins, we find polystrate lycopsids, and they were hollow. And so that's important, because
then I still have the same question, right?
Well,
because you have the same depositional event occurring for everything at the same time. Again, over the course of a year or whatever, that's still in geologic time really fast.
Yeah.
So what is I mean, the same logic applies to chalk deposits, all those other isolated geologic depositional environments. And I don't need, I know we got a lot of people, we can have this discussion some other time, of course, later, but that's my big thing. Well, it's not my big thing. That's one of the things is it happened in Loggins. You drive, 1,000 miles to the east where there was trees. Why didn't those trees get the same, or why didn't those fossils not polystrate in the same way when it all happened simultaneously?
Well, I would say, Org, that looking at the remnants of a global flood is like looking at the trash left after a tornado multiplied by 1,000,000 or more. You're looking at a conglomeration of so many incalculable different competing physical forces, competing concepts of like, well, this happened to be here, but then that water flow current happened to hit it at that specific angle. I mean, we still don't know why the trees are prostrate, but the lycopsids are polystrate at Joggins. But it has something to do with, the dynamics of the water flow and how those lycopsids happened to be oriented. Now, let's say that they weren't oriented in that way. Well, would they have just been smashed to smithereens by the water and not preserved? Perhaps. So one thing is that people underestimate just the sheer complexity of trying to piece together the remnants of a global flood, which we cannot repeat or view in any way. Now, the second thing I would say is that people tend to overestimate the degree to which the global fossil record is actually cataloged and documented. When you say, why don't we find more? I could ask the same question. Why don't we find so much more? It's because There's only a certain number of people out there actually documenting stuff. How much, what percent of the whole surface of the Earth and all of the strata all over the planet, what percent of that do you think has been currently documented? And do we know exactly?
As Ian said, a lot of it isn't going to hold the fossils, right? You know, any volcanic or metamorphic layer isn't going to be holding that stuff. Yeah, the stuff gets erased away. I don't know if what you're saying is landing with me, and we probably wouldn't expect it anyways. I'll head out now, but before I go, thanks for chatting with me, guys. I'm sure we'll do this again. Donnie, I wanted to ask you as well. Kent, when I asked Kent my geophysics magnetic reversal question, he said there was an ICR article that addressed it. I have no idea what he's talking about. Everything I found was from like the mid 90s. So if you know what Kent was talking about around like geomagnetic reversals didn't happen according to ICR, could you send that to me so I can figure it out? I'm assuming he's not talking about 40-year-old papers. So
yeah, I'll message him and I'll ask him what article he's talking about, and then I'll send it over to you.
All right, thanks guys. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate having you. Thank you, Org. Okay, now we've got the final boss, Grayson from Base Theory, ready to he's coming at you, Paul. He's got fighting words already. But in all seriousness, Grayson, good to have you. He's always ready for a good debate or discussion. He's discussed polystrate fossils on many occasions, including in your last debate with Kent, Grayson. So how you doing tonight? And which point would you like to touch on first? Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks for that introduction, Donnie. So unfortunately, I missed y'all's opening presentation. So sorry about that. Donnie kind of alerted my attention to this as it was going on. So when I tuned in, you guys were talking about, you were addressing the question about why aren't polystrate fossils found between two layers that the scientists claim to be millions of years apart. And the answer that I was hearing to that was that, well, if they find a polystrate fossil between two layers, then they will revise their dating of these layers. So do you have an actual example of that happening, or was that just speculation?
Well, that was largely just my, I guess, overall picture of how these things tend to be subjectively determined. So, and I also don't mean to imply that that's the only thing that might happen. As I also stated, it's also entirely possible that the scientist would disbelieve their own eyes and refuse to document it and just say, I don't know what that is. Just like Mary Schweitzer had to do her soft tissue experiment, like I think she said 19 times in a row or something before she would believe her own eyes. When you have a strong preconception about what you are supposed to see, you absolutely can refuse to believe your own eyes if you see something that you are not supposed to see. So is it possible that your hypothetical scenario, is it possible that they would revise it? I'm speculating. Yes, it's possible they would revise it, but another possibility is that they just wouldn't document it in the first place.
You understand that sounds quite conspiratorial, right?
That's your word, not mine. Ian, what do you think?
I'm still going back to the question of I'm going back to the original premise, and I can't think of any examples, but if they did find that, then they would reevaluate it. I mean, because clearly if you've got a polystrate fossil that's going between, say, two major epochs, you're going to wind up reinterpreting the time scale.
Exactly.
If they even published on it.
No, that's exactly my point, is that since I believe, and again, I missed the opening presentation, so correct me if I have a wrong understanding of this, but I believe that the point that you guys were trying to make is that these polystrate fossils are differentiating lines of evidence that exclude the scientific consensus and are explained by the young Earth scenario. So in order for these to be differentiating lines of evidence, I would expect that it would require a polystrate fossil going between two layers that the scientific consensus claims are too separated in time to be explained in the consensus model. That's what I would think you would need as an example.
Right. I see what you're saying. Okay. And actually, Paul brought this up at the beginning. So he brought up a quote from John Calder, which I had never actually heard before. But you can see in what Calder was writing how suddenly now he's saying that this polystrate tree was probably buried in a century, which even that I object to, but nevertheless, I'll give him that. You can see the changing the goalposts, because he's the first one I've ever heard claim that what represents 100 years. Every other claim has been it takes millions of years per inch. Every other claim.
Do you acknowledge the fact that sedimentation rates can vary at different locations on Earth? And it can be faster in some areas than others. Like, I believe that the explanation for why the sedimentation occurs so quickly at Joggins is because there's an underlying salt layer. And there's a mechanistic explanation for why sedimentation occurs so quickly at Joggins. I think it's haliokinesis, I think is the geologic term for the increase in sedimentation due to that salt layer being underneath of the formation.
For 18,000 vertical feet?
They called it evaporate withdrawal. Evaporate withdrawal.
I don't know. Maybe it's related, but I'm pretty sure that the term is halokinesis.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think that sedimentation can occur at different rates. But yeah, I mean, if within the consensus model, these upright fossils are buried pretty quickly within the span of less than 100 years. So I don't understand why y'all are saying that this is differentiating lines of evidence if it's easily incorporated into the consensus.
Well, I think, Grayson, to understand what differentiating means, we're not saying that it's impossible for an old earther to come up with any explanation for what we see. Okay, that's not the claim, because if that were the claim, then what we would be saying is that it's falsifying something. And as I explained in my historical science versus operational science presentation, falsification is a deductive process that does not apply to historical science. It applies to operational science. But there is no way you can find a piece of evidence that proves one thing or another about the unobservable distant past. So no, it's not differentiating in the sense that it's impossible for anybody to come up with a story to explain it. That's not the meaning. But rather, it's that it's a good marker of something that fits more elegantly into the global flood model than it does into the gradualism model.
Well, so that's your claim, is that it fits more elegantly into the flood model versus the consensus model. But I haven't, again, I'll go back and I'll watch your presentation, but I haven't so far in the conversations I have heard of this, I haven't heard why it fits better for the flood model versus the other. My second part question is just, why is it that for these examples of upright fossils, all the ones that I'm familiar with occur in areas that used to be ancient floodplains? Do you have any example of a polystrate fossil occurring in an area that was not an ancient floodplain?
But the very fact that you're claiming it's an ancient floodplain is not independent from the fact that we find polystrate fossils. They have to explain why we find the polystrate fossils, saying it's a floodplain is a way to explain the polystrate fossils.
Well,
And
I'm
I
talking
would
about
ask
like
you,
the type of fossils that are found
what
there
is
are.
your explanation, Grayson, for how we get the evidence that Ian and I have discussed tonight, including the polystrate lycopsids, which are hollow reeds with a pithy center, and we also find them oriented stumps upside down beneath the allegedly in situ lycopsid. So you see one lycopsid here, and then you see another one upside down beneath it. How do you explain that? Why would it be
Well,
upside down?
first of all, I haven't seen the upside down stump. I would need to see like independent verification that it is upside down. But I think the larger point here is that local floods definitely do happen. And local floods happen in floodplains all across the world.
How do you get an
That by
upside
itself
down?
is not indicative of a
How do you get an
global flood.
upside down tree beneath a right side up tree? Well, say tree. It's not a tree, but how do you get that? Give me your gradualistic explanation. Upside down lycopsid beneath right side up lycopsid.
I believe I just gave the explanation. You kind of cut me off in the middle of it, so I wasn't sure if you're listening, but I did just give the explanation. I said local floods occur all over, and a local flood can easily do that, no? And again, just because there's evidence of local floods occurring in floodplains does not indicate a global flood.
And to take that and run with it for a second, do bear in mind, if we're talking about just Joggins, we're talking about 18,000 vertical feet of sediments. So that's a lot of sediments. That's what? That's more than 3 times the depth of Grand Canyon. Where on earth would you find 18,000 vertical feet of sediments that they would claim was all one short time frame or one series of, say, local floods?
And what is
and
the
also,
sorry, I was just going to ask you for clarification. What is like the current consensus for like in mainstream for how long that 18,000 feet was formed?
I'd have to go back and look. I believe they were claiming 20 million years, and that was a long time ago. So I'd have to go back and look to see what the current mainstream thinking is. And also bear in mind, we're talking not just vertically, but also that layer is found for, well, I'd have to look it up, but it's tens of thousands of square kilometers. That layer, you can trace it right out to the coast.
Sure.
In Cape Breton, like 500 kilometers.
Well, if it's occurring over the span of millions of years, it sounds a lot more reasonable to me than if it was like the consensus was saying that these 18,000 feet of vertical layerings occurred in 100 years or something. So it doesn't inherently sound unreasonable to me for that to occur over millions of years, but I am not a geologist, so I'm not an expert on Joggins formation or sedimentation or whatever. But
it sounds like they're definitely gonna, unless I'm somehow off base here, in order to get from 100 years for one entire like 8-meter tall lycopsid fossil, that's only a century, and you're gonna extrapolate somehow to get like 20 million years out of the formation. There's probably gonna have to be unconformities in there.
Sure, why would that be an issue?
Well, because it's missing evidence.
Again, why is that an issue, though? I don't see why that is necessarily relevant for this discussion.
Well, because you claim that sedimentation produces all this evidence, but then for millions of years, nothing happens and there's zero evidence for it. That's a problem.
Again, I really don't see how that is an issue here. Like, yes, unconformities do exist. Would I prefer to have a perfect record? Sure, but I mean, the reality is that there are parts missing, and that's not differentiating between these two models for tonight's discussion. But just really quick on just backtracking a little bit, when you brought up Mary Schweitzer, she's made her career off of her discoveries that overturned the consensus. So, like, I would think that if a scientist stumbled upon something that actually overturned consensus, and they were saying, like, well, wait, these layers that are in my textbooks, they're supposed to be millions of years apart, but here's a polystrate fossil going between them. Like, that's a big deal. You could make a career off of figuring out something like that and rewriting the textbooks. I would think the incentives would be pretty clear for the scientist who stumbles across that.
Now, that what you just said about Mary Schweitzer is not true. She did not make her career off of the discovery. In fact, she came up against a lot of hostility from colleagues, and her funding was cut. So no, she did
in
not.
the short term, but in the long term, she's famous for making that discovery, and that's like one of the biggest discoveries attached to her name.
Or perhaps infamous.
Infamous is probably the better word.
Like I acknowledge that at first she was coming up with a lot of pushback for her ideas, but she continued and showed empirically that her stance was correct. She had the evidence to support it, and she changed the consensus because she provided the evidence. And like her career is like she's very well positioned in her career now, and this is a big like part of her track record was these discoveries. So I reject your characterization of it, Paul.
You're free to do that, but we both agree that she encountered massive hostility and lost her funding. And if I'm a scientist and I don't want to lose my funding and I don't want to encounter massive hostility, then I might think about what I'm doing. You know,
sure. If you don't want to make a groundbreaking discovery that potentially overturns the consensus and you get your name in the history books, sure.
It takes a certain character to be willing to swim against the current. And what Mary Schweitzer did, whether she realizes it or not, is that she helped provide some of the strongest evidence for young Earth creationism.
Don't be ridiculous now.
Has
Come on.
come out of the last 30 years. But
I mean, she literally includes a disclaimer on her paper saying, "Young Earth creationists, this is not evidence of your position. Stop using this as evidence." She literally says that.
That is exactly the point. She did not go against consensus.
Yeah,
she did go against consensus. I mean,
no, she did. She still embraces the millions of years. She never challenged that.
Yeah, but okay, Ian, you would acknowledge that there's different consensus. Like there's the consensus of the old Earth, sure, but then there was the consensus that things like collagen should not be found in fossilized bone. She overturned that consensus. She didn't overturn the age of the Earth consensus. There's different consensus here.
Agreed.
So, guys, let's keep it on Joggins and Polystrate fossils for tonight. But it's turning into
plus I gotta go. We're way past my bedtime.
Yeah. I was going to jump in. I think because we are at the 2 hour and 15-minute mark, I do appreciate the time that Ian and Paul have given to us, and also for the skeptics like you, Grayson, who have joined us. So maybe we'll wrap it up there in terms of the debate portion, and we'll go into some real quick final words, final thoughts. Grayson, thank you for joining. I'll allow you to enjoy the rest of your night. And okay, so 2 hour audience. I appreciate all the super chats, the questions. We really only got through a small fraction of our overall questions tonight, brothers. Maybe at some point in the future, we can do a follow-up on this topic and go through some of these. But for me as a moderator and observer, I would like to do some final words, final thoughts from everybody. Firstly, that was an excellent program with some great discussion, some great interaction with the chat, and some fantastic impromptu debate, very edifying. Maybe I missed some certain aspects of the debate portions, but I didn't see a better explanation provided for the existence of these polystrate trees. I think the Genesis flood best explains the reality of polystrate fossils in general. I saw talk about footprints, for example, with Joel. Org was asking, why don't we see more of these polystrate fossils? But not necessarily a better explanation, a superior explanation to the Genesis flood. Anyways, that was my takeaway. Would you gentlemen agree? And I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. Paul, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I would agree that we didn't hear a better explanation given. The only explanation we were given for Joggins was local floods.
Right.
I find that incredible when you look at the particulars of what we see at Joggins. It does not have that appearance. And the local flood claim still depends on the assumption that the lycopsids are in situ, and we showed evidence tonight that they're not in situ. So I think the local flood claim just does not fit the evidence nearly as well, as a global flood explanation.
Paul, if you don't mind, I do want to honor this real quick because it is a $10 super chat. Maybe we can just do a real quick power round because Ian, I know it's past your bedtime. But again, I just want to show my appreciation to everybody who supported tonight's event. I think this was really good and just edifying. So just talking about $10 super chat. Thanks for the support. So he says, if we horizontally slice multi-layer polystrate fossils, is there a striking gradient of minerals / inclusions that sync with surrounding strata's mineral content, or are they mostly uniform throughout? Did you gentlemen have any thoughts on that?
I would be curious to know the answer to that myself. I don't know if anyone has done that kind of a study.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm following the question here. If he is, if he's referring to, or she, my apologies. If you're referring to, say, for example, the sediments and whatnot inside the polystrate fossils, because they're hollow, the minerals and inclusions are pretty much matched on the inside. But also bear in mind that the stumps, the hollow plants, they are. I don't think I've ever seen one that was not split vertically up the side. And so this split in the trunk would allow the sediments that are burying it to also go inside, which is also an explanation for why we find, say, amphibians in the bottoms of the stumps, because they can go in through that split. It raises intriguing questions, all of it. So I'm sorry. I hope that's what they were asking about.
Well, lots of research to be had. That's why it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. So real quick, we'll wrap it up with this one. $4.99. I appreciate the support. Is there any insight whatsoever that some polystrate fossils are trees not native to the geography that they're found in?
Okay, this comes back to Orj's question, or Org's question, however he pronounces it.
He goes by many.
Okay, because I'm still not following what he was getting at, because the sheer scale of the polystrate fossil deposits is enormous. I've hardly scratched the surface, and I have gone all over North America, and except for the Canadian Shield, there's polystrate fossils everywhere.
I think it was a false premise that he was claiming that we don't have many. I don't think we need to accept that premise that we don't have many.
Right. Well, and one that comes to mind, which I have not made it to yet, is Axel Heiberg Island, which is up in the very high Canadian Arctic. And the lead researcher was a militant evolutionist and anti-creationist. And there are polystrate stumps there that are buried in the sediments, and they're still fresh. I have samples in my museum. You can cut them with a handsaw, drill them with a drill. You can light them on fire. The Eskimos would build fires with them. It's fresh wood, and they compared they're tropical plants, they're tropical trees, or at the very least temperate. And they took a look at the tree rings, and the tree rings of these polystrate trees, they were growing 3 to 4 times more thicker wood in one growing season than temperate trees in BC. So these tropical and temperate trees are way up. I think they're 75 degrees latitude, if I recall. I'd have to look it up again, but they're way up there. And they are exhibiting incredible growth with no late wood. And the late wood is grown in preparation for winter. So in other words, and this is evolutionists saying this, these trees saw no winter at 75 degrees latitude, which is way above the tree line today. Those trees, I would say, are not supposed to be there. That's one example of some polystrate fossils, and they call them fossils even though they're not fossilized. But
all right, very good, Ian. You gentlemen have clearly studied this topic, and that's why I was thrilled to have you both here. Ian, I'll throw it to you if you had any quick final words and final thoughts. Do you, I guess, kind of bouncing off of what Paul said in his final words, do you believe that the local flood argument for polystrate fossils is a superior or even equal explanation to that of the Genesis flood, a worldwide flood explaining these?
For the simple reason that if you want to call the local flood, that's fine. But if you're talking a local flood that was 500 kilometers in width and stacked up 18,000 vertical feet of sediments, that's not a local flood. That is a global catastrophe. I think we can all agree on that part.
We can all agree on that. That's for sure. Okay, gentlemen. Well, this has been excellent. 2.5 hours has flown by. I appreciate the presentation, the answers, and just all of this information. This program definitely deserves 2 or 3 rewatches. So, Ian, I hope this encourages more people to check out the movie that you're going to be releasing soon, if I'm correct on that, on Noah's Flood.
NoahFlood.com, not Noah's Flood.com. Okay. There's no S. The guys that made the Ark in the Darkness movie,
right?
For whatever reason, they got the domain Noah's Flood, even though we've had Noah Flood for like 10 years. But yes, NoahFlood.com, and we even have an ad for the Ark in the Darkness on there right now, going to Noah's Flood. But yes, thank you very much.
Right. Okay, well, I appreciate it. For those that want to see more from our guests tonight, our learned guests, clearly, Paul and Ian, you both did an excellent job tonight interacting with the critics. That's what we do here. It gets us out of our echo chambers, and it allows those that disagree with our viewpoints here on Origins the opportunity to interact with our points. So again, Ian, Paul, for the audience, check the description box and also the live chat for the relevant links to their channels, websites, so on and so forth. So with that, we are going to wrap things up, and God bless. Thanks for tuning in. Stand for Truth is out.